Welcome here. Are we live?
We're live?
Yeah, we're live.
All right.
All right.
Welcome. Thank you all for tuning in. My name is Jason, team member here at Bright Agtech. I'm also a big fan of sustainable business and want to welcome you to our live chat today, Investing in Indoor Farming. We're going to deliver some really critical insights for investment in the industry. Hello to you, Nate.
Hi. Setting a high bar there.
Yes. Well, and we've been following these trends. You know, I read, everybody's reading almost daily as a new project goes into their community. Big companies, corporations are building these facilities. We're not seeing that level of small and medium producers just yet, but it's a fractured industry, or it's not dominated by any one major player. So there's room for these small and medium producers. And we'll get into that a little bit. We're going to go through an introduction, give our viewers a few more minutes to get online. It's 5 o'clock here in beautiful Wyoming. If you're not familiar with Bright Agtech, we're a startup based in Laramie, Wyoming, also known as the High Plains. And Nate, you've been patenting equipment, innovating, building these projects around the nation here for a number of years. And so I'm excited to hear some of the insights that you have to take away.
Yeah, you bet.
One of the trickier things that we want to talk about, and it's hard to unpack, is what scale of project are we talking about? What's the biggest project you're currently working on?
I think right now probably our biggest project out there is around 10,000 square feet. We've got a few much larger ones in the work, so hopefully by the end of the year we'll have some much larger ones. But typically, we're talking about pretty small operations, and ultimately that's where there's people talk about like middle out expansion, and with the produce market, I think that what we're really going to see in the future is from the outsides in. And so traditionally we just have this big, market where there's a few big players that service this whole thing. Everything looks the same, tastes the same, comes from the same people. And really what we're talking about is small producers attacking that market from the bottom, and a couple of big disruptive companies coming in at the top and filling a significant amount of that market that these big, huge companies, traditional conventional growers have filled.
Yeah. We'll get to some finance in another session. If you haven't been following the industry, the big players like Gotham Greens and Bright Farms are really leveraging these sophisticated financing mechanisms. And they'll lock up a supply agreement with a whole chain of grocery stores before they ever build the facility. And that's a way for them to, sell the project to their investors, make sure they have a market for the produce when they do finally plant it. It's a type of financing that these big players can use. The small and medium growers may not have the same access to capital, and it's tricky, right? How do you advise the small and medium grower to get a project financed?
Yeah, so there are a lot of options out there, and we've talked about a lot of them in previous webinars with Barn Raiser, talking about crowdfunding, banks and traditional finance, and increasingly more and more growers that are taking venture capital money. So yeah, I mean it's that landscape is diversifying very, very quickly. There are a lot of different sources for capital out there. And the further we get into this and the more people are kind of starting to look at this and say, oh, holy cow, there might actually be some money here, the more funding sources are opening up.
Right.
So it's changing really fast. I mean, 10 years ago, there was very few options out there as far as funding for small producers go, but it's beginning to diversify. Ultimately, most of our really small producers just start with savings. They just start with their own money, or they raise money from friends and family. And get going.
Start with a few local customers.
Start small, scale up.
Grow from there.
Yep.
Fantastic. Did want to point out that we are digging deep into the indoor farming world. We'll be covering sessions here in the next couple weeks on operating expenses, capital startup expenses, financing, rates of return and profitability. So if you get the chance, please join us. Again, my name is Jason, sitting here with the CEO of Bright Agrotech, Nate Story. And I think we're all about full, ready to go. So I'm going to jump right in.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So last session we talked about something called field parity. The idea that we can grow these crops indoors as economically as you can in the field.
Right.
It's a pretty dramatic shift in the way we think about food production.
It's a huge shift.
And we're talking about the trends that are continuing to drive this forward. So costs are coming down. Today we're talking about consumer trends. So, for example, organic has been the driver of a lot of growth in farming and small family farms.
You bet.
What's happening now with the shift from organic to local food?
Yeah, so organic was one of the most interesting marketing programs in modern agriculture by far. Back in the mid-'90s, a bunch of guys in Washington started chatting about how they could sell this exact same produce for more. And ultimately what they came up with was the organic standards and USDA organic, this idea that we would build this set of standards for growing produce, and then if you adhered to those standards, if you were certified, that you could get the certification, and that would lend value to the product, right? And it's supposed to represent transparency. It was supposed to represent sustainability. It was supposed to represent health, human health.
Right.
And all of these different things that consumers have been wanting for a long time. It's not a modern thing. It is the last 30 years people have wanted transparency. They've wanted sustainability and healthy food, right? So that's kind of how it got going, and went to market, and it grew incredibly fast. So you now, instead of just one category of produce at the store, you had two categories. You had conventional and organic. And but people have started to become really jaded. Some of the worst food poisonings of the last decade have been all organic produce. People have started to realize the farms that are growing the organic right next to the conventional, there's really not that much of a difference in practices.
Well, I tried to scale, right? I mean, these bigger farms have to try to adopt organic practices.
Right.
Or they might want to adopt those.
It became
practices.
such a valuable market that everyone got into it. And really, ultimately, it's just been co-opted by some very big companies. And so the very values that it was supposed to embody, sustainability, is it more sustainable? Well, arguably, in most scenarios, not really. At least not how it's practiced in the West, organic growing, right? Transparent. Is it transparent? Absolutely not. Good luck trying to figure out where that was grown or how it was grown. And from a health perspective, even that has been really, really questionable the last decade and a half. And so people are already primed for local markets, right? They're already primed for local produce. They're already primed to really buy into this idea that if I buy this from someone local, I get the sustainability, I get the transparency, I get to shake his hand, right? That's hard to cheat on.
Right.
And I get something that's healthier for me.
Excellent. Sorry to burst your bubble on organics, but we are seeing a dramatic shift. I don't have a good photo here, but the Hartman Group is publishing a study showing that the authenticity of organics are starting to fade. Consumers are asking for local. We're seeing more labels, locally grown. People are asking, where was this grown? And so right here alongside that is these indoor farms, local producers growing the food. And if you're not familiar with that, that's the Hartman Group. You can find them online, and showing how local food is poised to surpass organic. We're talking about a potentially $9 billion market for supplying these local greens and herbs.
Yeah, you bet.
So
huge market.
Good. Um, I'm a little curious how much of this is grassroots and how much of it will become actual, industry, larger businesses. How many farmers does it take to feed a whole city?
Yeah, I think what we're going to see, if it's executed properly, if it's executed correctly, is a few of these, field producers will always be there, but they're going to lose a significant amount of market share to indoor growers, like so very large scale indoor growers doing massive operations. And these small growers are going to take a pretty significant share of that market as well. So maybe 20, 30, even 40% of the market potentially being supplied. All of the folks who have traditionally been buying, the really high quality organic are already buying at health food stores, buying local. That really care about that. That's going to be a significant amount of the population. Now, no one said that back in the 90s, organic was for the top 5%, and then 3 or 4 years later, it's the top 10%, and then it's kept growing now. I forget what the last poll was. It was the majority of the population bought organic products quite regularly. Not all organic, but bought organic products. So this went from this tiny little market to this massive market. And I think we're going to see the same thing happen with local.
Yep.
They're scoffing at it now, but it's growing much, much faster than organics.
Well, I'm a believer in this because people want to participate in their local food system. When it used to be 42% of the U.S. population lived and worked on a farm. Today that number's 2% or less, right? Massive shift to the city. Now these are urban residents largely, and they still want to participate in their food system. So this is a way for them to do that. So I'm a believer. And the next thing that's happening here, consumers are asking for locally grown food, but it's hard to grow it, right?
Yep.
You can't just grow food in any location. And so how are these innovations in technology helping supply the consumer demand?
Yeah, so the way to think of it is you have a consumer demand, which is a pull, right? And you have technology, which is kind of a push. And so this industry is growing up between this pull from consumer demand and this push from technology. And technology is really kind of fundamental to the industry itself. I mean, in the last one, we talked a lot about LEDs and how, that just this very predictable and interesting increase efficiency and drop in cost. Well, it hasn't nearly happened to that extent, but, just some of the changes in the last 10 years, say in HVAC and the ability to install that effectively in these types of environments. When we're talking about wireless controls, controls in general, sensor technology, all of these different things. An example of this would be like a dosing system. 30 years ago, you could really only afford a dosing system if you were a very large farm, at least one that was really efficient, right? Because the sensors were very expensive. And the technology to do that was much costlier, much cruder. Today, you can put in an IntelliDose for $3,000 and it can run a fairly large facility for you. So this is technology that's evolved very dramatically.
Yeah, and one of the maybe the criticisms of indoor farming is that this is a tech trend. It's not an appropriate technology.
Right.
It's just another kind of fad. Right.
Yeah.
And so can you speak maybe to this idea of appropriate technology? Or is this really something that communities can use to grow their food?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, appropriateness is like fundamental to any kind of technology. And, there are a lot of very fair claims that indoor growing is just a fad for right now. But most of those claims are being made by people who are either not in the industry and don't necessarily see what's happening, and certainly are not made by people that are enjoying the benefits of this year-on-year progress, both on the technology side, so reductions in cost, increases in efficiency on technology, and massive increases in demand on the consumer side.
Right.
And so when we're talking about, technology, it's absolutely appropriate.
Right.
I mean, we have an absolutely the market changes. in a positive way every single year.
Yeah.
You know, we have seen dramatic growth year on year.
Well, and the reality is, if the consumers are demanding it, it has to come from somewhere.
That's right.
Shipped thousands of miles. We hear a lot about food miles. You know, you can't just choose not to eat lettuce.
Well,
Right?
I mean, you could, but
Right.
but yeah, I mean, no, and that's an interesting thing. You know, starting with organic really taught consumers
Yeah.
that, you know, you've got two heads of lettuce. They look identical. They taste identical, really.
Yeah.
They're just in slightly different packaging, really. And that changes the fundamental value of the product.
Yeah.
Like, organic was the most powerful marketing movement in modern ag by far. Local has the opportunity not to just be marketing, but to actually be an increase in quality.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you're transporting something 1,000 miles, I don't care if it's 2 days on a truck. You compare lettuce that's 2 days on a truck versus lettuce that's 2 hours from harvest, and there's a fundamental difference in the product. Right? And you can't buy time. There are just some things you cannot necessarily buy. And local producers, in all of those regards, when it comes to all of those features of the product that are tied directly to location, proximity to market, speed of harvest, speed of getting that to the consumer, and those types of qualities, there's absolutely no way that a guy in California can, shipping stuff to Chicago, compete with a guy who's growing in Chicago.
Well, that's interesting. Fresher produce that tastes better. You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, moving on here, Nate. We refer regularly to this white paper, Indoor Crop Production, Feeding the Future by New Bean Capital. And they're saying some of the same things that you're talking about. Consumers want year-round, fresh produce, and the technology is enabling people to grow it.
Correct.
Seems like a match made in heaven. Unfortunately, it does raise a lot of problems, or a lot of questions, misunderstandings. So that's why we're here today. And as investors are starting to look at this industry, maybe wrestle with some of these questions, you and the team at Bright Agritech are trying to clear up the misunderstandings, empower growers. You work mostly with growers. You're not just a media presence, right? And so we're trying to shed some light on all this. The third question that we're talking about is the triple bottom line. Kind of bringing this all together, can these facilities provide benefits for the community? Can they create jobs at a profit? And is it better for the environment, right? And that's a lot to bite off. Let's just talk about the values that your farmers are bringing to the table, trying to benefit the community.
Yeah, you bet. So I think one of the interesting things about this, when you look back at the kind of the original organics movement, you see a lot of the same kind of ideals and philosophies and values that you see in the modern day local movement, right? And if you believe that kind of the embodiment, the fully grown the way the movement looks fully grown starts with kind of the original intent, then I think that kind of gives us insight into what the local produce movement is going to look like. Most of the folks that are focused in on starting these types of operations are triple bottom line kind of people. They are about their community and sustainability in a community sense. They of course have to be profitable because a lot of these folks are, they have to be financially sustainable as well as socially and environmentally sustainable. And then they are, of course, concerned about the environment and the effects that agriculture has on the environment. So, yes, they're concerned about all of these things. And if you can get environmentalists who care deeply about the environment to start growing indoors, and they've done the math on it, and they're convinced that this is better than growing in a field. And there's a lot of research that is, as more people are looking at the carbon costs of all these different things, the externalities kind of big ag.
Right.
Small ag makes a lot more sense.
I was thinking about something you said, and Mark Bittman was writing in the New York Times, and the food blog, and his first recommendation was to end subsidies to big ag. and start providing subsidies to small farmers.
Yeah.
Is,
Good luck
is
with
that
that.
one way to jumpstart the industry?
I mean, eliminating subsidies to big ag is, that's a place to start, right? I think that everyone can get on board with that pretty much. Except
I hope the Washington D.C. you guys are watching.
I'm not scared of you. Yeah, I mean, so it's very complicated.
Yeah.
It's very complicated. I mean, all of the things that have given rise to big ag, it's not fair to lay it all at the feet of government. The reality is that the market has kind of pushed things in that direction as well.
Let me get us a little bit back online here. You're arguing that there's room in communities all across the nation for these facilities to step in, start growing the food at a profit,
Yeah.
and selling to local customers, CSAs, restaurants,
You bet.
retail, and that this is a profitable endeavor.
Yeah, so I think, when you mention CSAs, when you mention small accounts, right, that's what you're talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
So traditionally, you've had producers in the field, they grow, they sell to a distributor. Distributor might sell it to another distributor or an aggregator. He sells it to, a big restaurant chain or a grocery store chain, or to a food supply company like Cisco or Costco, Cisco or Shamrock or US Foods or what have you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they truck it around and they sell it to all the small accounts. Really, the only thing those guys are doing is logistics, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're taking big amounts of produce and they're breaking it down into small amounts and selling it out into these to these small accounts, essentially. It's all logistics work. And so when we think about small producers and what they are uniquely situated to service in a market sense, we're talking about a lot of small accounts, right? There's a lot of small accounts out there that are being serviced by kind of these big companies. They're getting poor quality. And with the advent of the internet and our ability to reduce the overall transaction costs, that's the beautiful thing that we can use computers and the internet to do is organize, take care of all sorts of logistic things and reduce transaction costs. We're talking ultimately about the ability of small people, doing relatively small amount of things to do fairly complex distribution strategies.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the very exciting things when we talk about, room in any community to do this. That's absolutely right. All of any community has a restaurant. Any community has a school. There are programs. There are all sorts of accounts out there being serviced by these guys, and they're unhappy.
Yeah. So, for our watchers here, I want to thank you for tuning in. We're going to dig in a little bit to the numbers in some of our next few sessions. You're talking about small producers servicing their local market. And I want to get a sense of how much it costs, to get into the market, to start providing, those vegetables to local restaurants and CSAs. Just for, the people watching, what are the biggest expenses or costs that these producers are facing in their operation?
Yeah, so from a cost perspective, you have kind of the initial capital expense, and the type of farm you set up and start running really plays into that. And then you have all of your operational expenses, so your capex and your opex. And for indoor growers, that capital expense is very high. You're building a factory. You're not building a garden. You're not building. We call it a farm, but it's really more of a factory, right? If you're doing soil gardening, then of course your capex is typically fairly low, or it should be. It isn't always, but your operational expenses are much, much higher, right? Especially in kind of the produce scene for the produce that we grow, that many of our farmers grow. So the cost can be significant. The question on all of these things always comes back to market. What will the market handle? What do they want? What are the prices I can get? What kind of produce can I sell? And it really comes back to market questions. So hugely variable. We have folks that have $1 million or $2 or $5 million of capital expense, and then $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a month of operational expenses.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Down to folks who have $2,000 of capex and very small operating expenses, but it's a different scale.
Right.
So it really just depends.
Okay, so for future sessions, we're gonna get it. Your company provides consulting for customers and clients who want to grow in the city or in their location, right? And we're going to be walking through some of the numbers that you generally provide in a consulting arrangement. We can't do a specific case study because we can't share client information, but I want to get a sense of capex, opex,
You bet.
profitability for a typical or average facility. How much can you grow? How much does it cost to grow it? And what was the startup cost? Your investment to get that operation off the ground.
You bet.
So it's a good opportunity to do a call out. If you guys are interested in following what we're doing, I want to invite you to go to brightagrotech.com/innovation, and we'll be sharing some of our highest value insights into capital expenses, operating expenses, profitability, and Nate has agreed to share that information with you. They're going to be very valuable sessions and very valuable information. So I'm really excited for that, Nate.
Yeah, you bet.
As we kind of close up, I want to invite you guys to send in your audience questions. You can do those right in the chat bar. And we'll take a couple audience questions. While we wait, I want to touch briefly on environmental impact in conventional ag. So we know that, I'm struggling here. We know that conventional agriculture is not neutral environmentally.
Right.
Why isn't not an apples to apples comparison when we talk about environmental impacts?
Sure. So, carbon cost accounting is kind of a dark black magic, if you will. But yeah, I mean, for comparing a head of, say, local produce to something that's produced, say, 1,000 miles away, we like to just look at cost, just price. And as the actual cost of fuels begins to reflect their actual value, right, and which will happen over time. Over time, there will be fewer and fewer subsidies. There will be fewer and fewer kind of externalities, and the cost of fuel will reflect its actual cost, and not a subsidized cost, not a cost in certain conditions, right? That becomes easier and easier and easier. And what we begin to realize is that field produce has a much higher cost than we realize, because there are a lot of externalities there, whether it is subsidies, whether it is just lower cost of doing business at scale due to different external factors, right, that are not necessarily accounted for in real cost. But ultimately, what we're looking at is a carbon cost that is much, much higher than we think. So the beautiful thing about local producers is that it's much more transparent, right? So I can look at a facility and I know exactly how much energy I'm consuming, right? I know exactly where that energy is coming from.
You know how much gas it takes to get that produce to the market.
Yep, and there are no subsidies for small producers. There are some great things about living in certain areas as far as the cost of electricity. There's a great argument to be made that all of our cost is artificially low when it comes to electricity and other energy resources.
Right.
But it's much easier to calculate the carbon cost of, say, something in our greenhouse than it is to calculate the average cost of something that comes from the field.
Okay. So the takeaway there is it's a dark science trying to account for all the carbon costs that go into, field-grown production.
Yeah, and it's not some hippy-dippy rainbows and unicorn kind of stuff. It's really going to represent the real cost of the product down the road. Like, we can't be naive and assume that the costs of our fuels are going to stay where they're at forever or be cheaper in the future. Like, the reality is we're dealing with resources, and over time they're going to more closely reflect their actual cost and their actual value.
Okay. You heard it from Nate. We'll move to audience question. And again, thank you for tuning in. We want to shed light on the indoor growing industry and help clear up any misconceptions that are out there. So if you have a question, please send it in to us, or you can tweet using hashtag #FarmingIndoors. So Nate, first question here from Max. For a very large indoor growing setup, is there any point in including aquaponics in the indoor facility?
There can be, but only in very specific kind of scenarios. So aquaponics is a lot of fun, but typically the cost, if I were to build out a facility, and I were to build out a hydroponic production facility, my cost would be almost half the cost of building out an aquaponic production facility of the same productive capacity. So not quite half, but almost half. So what that really represents is a whole bunch of additional costs. Well, then you have to look at the value of the fish that you're producing and the marketing value of your growing technique. And you have to really analyze those, right? Because fish in most locations are a break-even product, which means that you can't count on making a lot of money on fish, if any. Sometimes fish are a loss. If that's true, then you're increasing the overall cost of your facility for marginal additional value. Right? And that's a very bad business decision. Now, I always say there's a lot more to it than business for many people. And I come from aquaponics. I love aquaponics. Aquaponics is a blast. I was a commercial aquaponics farmer for years. And probably I will be again in the future. It's a lot of fun. I love fish. I love plants. But that being said, we were profitable. We had to tear down the greenhouses last year to build on the site. But we'll farm aquaponically again. I had a profitable aquaponic farm, but man, it was hard. And the reality is that I know that if I moved in next door to myself and I grew hydroponically, I would eat my lunch. There's just no way that the aquaponic operation could compete with the hydroponic one. And that's the tough thing. The reason that it's not an absolute statement, don't do aquaponics, is because in some scenarios, aquaponics makes sense, but only in the scenarios where your market wants organic hydroponic produce. And arguably, even those scenarios are going to disappear. It's very likely that hydroponic facilities will not be USDA organic in the next couple of years. The industry, the NOSB, and kind of the folks that are influencing policy at the very high levels, it appears that they are going to move to make it impossible to get organic certification for hydroponic facilities. That goes for aquaponic as well as organic hydro. Mm-hmm. So these are all very big concerns. So you just have to know your numbers. I mean, that's all there is to it. You got to know your numbers, and you have to be in a market where you're not too concerned about competitors moving in and competing directly with you. You have to believe in your market.
Excellent. Thanks, Nate. And, following up on that a little bit, we talk about labels. Do you believe in labeling your produce? Absolutely.
The simplest value add that you can have for your product is to brand it, right? Now, I'm speaking from a very general sense. I'm not talking about USDA organic. I tell almost all my small growers, don't pursue it. Don't even go down the route of getting certified organic. The reality is, if you're selling into your local community, what we've seen among our growers is there's absolutely no difference in value to the consumer between local and organic. And when you have local organic against conventional local, there is almost never a price difference between the two. That's the most interesting thing. So what that means is that there's really very little value, a lot of liability, a lot of cost, and a lot of pain in going out and getting an organic label when local is free. Right. When local is...
So grown locally.
Slap local on it. Label it local. Yeah. Label it with your farm name, with your branding. Yeah. Put your phone number on there. People love that. Mm-hmm. When we were selling to our local markets, aggressively years ago, I'd give my phone number to all of our customers and say, hey, you got a question about your produce, call me day or night. And no one ever called me. But the fact that I handed them my phone number, I mean, that's kind of the ultimate in transparency.
I hadn't thought of that. That's incredible. We'll take a couple more. Question from Alex. Is it worth it to use grow lights in greenhouses during shoulder seasons in northern states or Canada?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it depends on your market. So I've grown under light and I've grown without any supplemental light, and we're certainly not as far north here in Wyoming as other folks are. If you are growing without supplemental light, and I will be honest with you, the main reason that I was not was that I was in a poly greenhouse, and I really didn't want people just taking an X-Acto knife and cutting into my greenhouse and walking off with my lights. Otherwise, I probably would have. You can do it if you're a seasonal grower. So if you're not growing in the middle of the winter, right? Because you're not going to get much production, and your cost of heating is going to be very high. So you basically taper off in the fall and come on in the spring. That's one way you can do it without lights. Or if you're selling to a CSA and you're just very, very clear with people like, hey, this is a 12-month CSA, and in the winter months you're just not going to get that much. That's really the only way you can make that work as a commercial grower. Otherwise, you do need lights. And as far as the shoulder seasons go, it's not just the dead of winter. You're looking at pretty significant increases in production. If, in the middle of the spring, when you're talking 12 hours of light, if you can bump that up to 16, 18 hours of light, especially where we're at, where the light quality is still not amazing, right? It's still relatively poor light quality in those spring and fall seasons. Additional supplemental lighting can be really, really, really great for producers.
And we'll get into it a little bit, Nate. It's hard to make a decision at what point do I need to invest in these supplemental lighting units. Is it worth the productivity for that November through March production?
It's a strategic decision. It's not a straight, do this, don't do that kind of decision. It's what is your market? How are you selling your produce? What's worth it?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want a vacation around Christmas time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
These are all things worth considering.
Right? Yeah. And we'll get into the numbers. I want to encourage you guys to keep us on your calendar. Nate's going to be sharing critical insights into operating expenses, energy costs, and capital expenses. So we'll get to that. We want to give it its appropriate treatment. Yep. You can't rush those things, and we really do need to understand the economics behind lighting and investment.
Yep.
Right. So last question here. Can a small indoor farm be successful in small scale New York? Question from Eddie Javier. Thanks, Eddie, for your question.
Yeah, so we have looked at very few scenarios where a farm is not viable. Now, what kind of farm it is, that is a big question, right? That is a big question. What kind of crop you're growing, what kind of market you're addressing, what kind of a size of a farm you want. These are all big question marks. But I almost guarantee you there are very few communities where a farm is not viable on some scale or on some level. Now, whether or not you want to run that farm, that's a whole different thing. So, rent is high, so that you got a sign over there that said that the rent is very high. That's a very important thing to look at on the front end. That is an ongoing operational expense. I am a huge fan of having a much bigger capex and minimizing opex, right? Minimizing your variable costs because those are somewhat unpredictable, and a nice big capex that you can amortize out of over time. You know exactly what your payments are on it. It's very predictable. You've signed a contract. Everything is predictable. That's great. Rent is kind of a hard one. If you're year to year, if you're month to month, it will really just depend on kind of how much risk you think you're assuming there and whether or not the economics work out. Because if your rent is high, there's some places where rent is just high. That's all there is to it. In those kinds of areas, in some of those areas, we've done like indoor farms where we condense things up, make them really, really tight, and we can produce a lot per square foot. There are other places where warehouse space is expensive, but field space is cheap. And then it makes sense to do a soil farm, especially if that's kind of more what the market wants. There's all sorts of different variables that go into that calculation. But knowing that your rent is high is an important part of figuring out what type of a farm to start in the first place.
Fantastic. Nate, we probably created more questions than we answered here, but that's why we're doing this. We want to shed some light on the economics. and help people make an informed decision about what type of growing to take on. And so, just for your information, the white paper indoor crop production feeding the future is showing 8 to 12% returns on indoor growing facilities. And we're going to dig in future sessions and try to understand how are these facilities generating 8 to 12% in profit year over year. And so that's going to be an exciting talk. I want to thank you guys for tuning in. We're going to sign off for today, and we'll continue to take audience questions and add those into our talks. So thank you very much, and so long.
Adios. Done.